Hi guys, welcome to Counterpoints. My name is Connor, and today we'll be addressing the Dallegations. I've gotten into hot water with Destiny and the DGG community over my perspectives on the Twitter files and Hunter Biden, and perhaps my passionate defense of my position.
You, okay? Literally,
You child.
No, you're fucking a dumb, evil, spoiled.
I felt like I got dogpiled so hard I was actually never really given the opportunity to forward my perspective, so we're going to do that here and also respond to some of the dumb counter-arguments that I received in that debate. Destiny allegedly invited me on after taking some interest in my tweets, but I want to point out right here that his invitation had no discussion of our positions, no demand that the Twitter files demonstrate something new or historic, and no hostility between the two of us, which is why the conversations were a little strange. Destiny. Want to chat about Elon and Twitter today? ? Smiley face emoji. Counterpoints. I'm in the wage cage until 7. You going to be on later? ? 9/11 emoji. Before we get into the debates themselves, I want to show my tweets and break down their meaning so you know where I'm coming from. Progressives acting like this is a nothing burger are delusional. Conservatives were making legal speech and were told for years that they weren't being shadow banned, they were just unpopular. This is now a provable lie and the shoe is on the other foot. So, let's break that down. Progressives acting like this is nothing are delusional. Conservatives might be being hyperbolic, but the fact that social media companies have close ties with three-letter agencies, consult on what to suppress, including legitimate threats like terrorist and criminal organizations, and fight over terms of service applications is absolutely worthy of having a contentious argument over. If this is an opaque process where the government is using the corporations as a proxy to suppress legally protected speech they dislike, that is a massive abuse of power and would require a transparent system and a prohibition of back channels. Even if it's revealed that there's been no intentional malice to date, that doesn't mean the system shouldn't be reformed and rendered transparent. Conservatives were making legal speech and were told for years they weren't being shadow banned, they were just unpopular. Conservatives were using speech that is protected by the First Amendment, but not protected by terms of service on social media platforms. According to some progressives, conservatives weren't being algorithmically suppressed, they were just unpopular. This is a semantic argument that hides the point of contention. I would say most creators claimed that their reach was being modified by the platform without their knowledge, and as a result, they did not have the popularity that would be otherwise available in a neutral environment. This has been confirmed by the Twitter files. This is now a provable lie, and the shoe is on the other foot. Good luck. From the Twitter files, at bare minimum, we know that some conservative pundits were restricted from advertising, searchability, and trending content. There's also no reason to suspect a parallel system isn't possible on YouTube. While this is not a comprehensive list of creators, and it's suspect we are only receiving partial disclosures, it is very clear that progressive claims about lack of popularity were flat out false. This tells me many progressives were more interested in deriding conservatives than being factually correct on this issue. Elon Musk is now in charge of Twitter and has already been accused of using the same system that once targeted conservatives against his critics, leftists, and pro-Ukrainian war accounts. Tweet 2 breakdown. You weren't shadow banned. You were algorithmically suppressed while being told you weren't, smugjack. This is where the semantic argument lies. Twitter has published in its terms of service that shadow banning is making it so only you can see your content and your tweets do not appear in the feed at all, including to followers. They have said that they don't do this, and that's corroborated by the Twitter leaks. However, just because that's written in the TOS does not mean that's what people were complaining about. People were complaining about bias against conservatives leading to the suppression, which is now confirmed by Twitter, actively reducing the visibility of profiles that had either violated or flirted with the terms of service. There's two arguments here. One is legalistic and the other one is moral. Legalistically, Twitter is a private company. It has the right to restrict what content it promotes on its website for its own financial and personal interest. But just because something is financially or legally justifiable does not make it good. It's clear that our national discourse is not just poisoned by what we are allowed to talk about, but also what we're not allowed to talk about. We live in a liberal society, and by definition, liberalism is required to tolerate the existence of anti-liberal ideologies. Within certain spaces like Twitter, many progressives are interested in suppressing these conversations for the greater good. But this is a culture war not just between conservatives and progressives who have different visions for the country, but liberals and progressives, where liberal ideology demands an open space to have national discourse and progressivism demands protection of vulnerable groups. This is the heart of the conflict and is interesting, even if it's not new. Tweet 3 and breakdown. Conservatives are cringe for thinking criminal charges will be brought against tech bros for putting their thumbs on the algorithm. Progressives are cringe for pretending it's not a big deal. Elon will put his thumb on the scale for the right, which will change national discourse. So let's break that down. Conservatives are cringe for thinking criminal charges will be brought against tech bros for putting their thumbs on the algorithm. Obviously, we knew that the three-letter agencies were coordinating with social media corporations to combat terrorism, which was revealed by the NSA Snowden leaks. After 2016, we also expected them to be working on election interference and consulting on misinformation/propaganda. So that's not new, but the fact that it was weekly meetings is interesting and is something that is even remarked in the Twitter files themselves. Definitely not meeting with the FBI, I swear, not to mention the chilling effect this can have on national discourse just by virtue of meeting with police officers every single week who want you to suppress or eliminate certain forms of speech. Just because Twitter resists this effort doesn't mean that this won't eventually become overwhelming. Progressives are cringe for pretending like it's not a big deal. You can say that conservatives were pushed out of the Overton window for reasonable terms of service violations and for the financial interest of companies, but you can't say that's not interesting considering the fact that the world's richest man, formerly richest man at this point, spent $44 billion to disrupt this exact dynamic. It's just not new under the narrow definition I was told I had to fit my argument into. Elon will put his thumb on the scale for the right, which will change national discourse. Up until this point, the Overton window on social media has been creeping left because of lockstep terms of service across multiple platforms. Conservatives and sympathetic liberals have been complaining that this is bad for national discourse. They, and I, have been arguing that leftists and progressives have been browbeating everyone else into groupthink, and that any resistance when it comes to transgender ideology, COVID information, election information, or Trumpism is at best angrily tolerated and at worst suppressed or banned. Even people, including myself, who disagree with Trumpism, transphobia, and intentional COVID misinformation think that this dynamic is unhealthy for society and is fueling the polarization we see in our modern politics. You can say it's not new, but it is a massive shift in the culture war. So let's get into the first debate. During the first debate, I was assigned the position that I believe that conservatives were being algorithmically suppressed for the simple crime of being conservative. To reiterate, I was asked by Destiny to come on to discuss the topic of Elon and Twitter. There was no discussion of my position or what I believe prior to me joining the stream. Nowhere in the above tweets or in my political content will you find the position I was repeatedly assigned. You will also not find the words new or historic in my tweets, despite that being repeatedly assigned to me. Destiny insisted on repeating that that was my view and argument, despite me rejecting it multiple times. I haven't just deep-throated every conspiracy theory, and I am quick to point out when people I like are using slanted propaganda. I specifically noted that in the conversation that all of the Twitter files were slanted to the right. My counter-argument, which I just think is demonstrably true, is the fact that there are topics that conservatives want to discuss, maybe in a bad faith manner, that are simply prohibited by social media. Specifically, vaccine efficacy, the security of elections, progressives pushing their value systems on children, race realism, and transgender folks/drag queens interacting with children are all hot button topics that are heavily moderated. Whatever your opinion on these topics, it's just fundamentally true that a large portion of conservatives have to either walk on eggshells or risk suspensions and bans when it comes to these subjects. I don't know how anyone sane could deny that as true, and it disproportionately affects conservatives since liberals and progressives dominate the social media companies. I had let's call him a friend. I had a friend bring up a killer argument in a post debate conversation where they said, if there was a social media company that was as popular as Twitter, run by conservatives, and then they banned any speech related to abortion if it was pro-abortion or basically, discussing how abortion, how abortion activism was positive, how if people got banned from having that conversation or having that conversation in an edgy way, it would be obvious to every progressive and liberal and leftist that that would be an anti-progressive slant. But as soon as we start talking about how conservatives can't have the conversations they want to have, however nefarious you deem those conservatives are, you fucking shove your head into the goddamn sand. No idea how people can't understand this concept very easily, but I fucking digress. Additionally, when Destiny asked about the Twitter files, I had read a majority of the Chaeiry files part 1, gotten bored, and then also read most of Weiss and gotten bored. Because like Destiny, I agreed nothing was new, but it was interesting as far as the broader discourse. I believe that Destiny had said there was a new comprehensive leak that disproved the assertions of the original Twitter files, and I took that on face value because I trust Destiny, usually. As an example, I would not be surprised if leftists, communists, and socialists were as persecuted by Twitter because while the tech oligopoly is progressive, I don't think they can afford to be anti-capitalist. The Twitter files, in their current form, just confirm the suppression and bias conservatives and liberals have been complaining about for a half decade and the opaque relationship between federal agencies and social media. That is interesting and shouldn't just be accepted as the best way to proceed societally, especially considering some of Musk's new actions. Now, I've seen Destiny Bloodsports before, so I've seen him deploy some of these debate tactics in the past, but to be honest, I was surprised he was deploying them against me. I took particular offense to the "I already know what you're going to say." This is a frustrating phrase because he can pretend that even before I outline my view, not only does he know it, but he's bored by it. It backs me into a corner where I can't articulate my view without interruption because he already knows it. Considering I'm a relatively intelligent fella, this phrase in particular pisses me the fuck off. This violates Daddy Peterson's rule for good communication, which is to treat everyone like they know something you don't. And this is particularly frustrating considering our history, Destiny and my history, of having a half dozen amicable debates and conversations. Now, I understand that I'm known for taking a long time to get to my point and for building out grand tapestries that most people recognize the pattern and point before I finish, but considering I'm being accused of being a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, I think I would be entitled to laying out my view before being attacked for it. So that rubbed me wrong out of the gate. Not only that, but I understand why ideologues are banned. Some political ideologues want to talk about controversial topics from a controversial lens. These factions include social conservatives, Christian nationalists, biological essentialists, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, and fascists. They actually believe the things that they believe because they are rooted in a relatively deep philosophical perspective that they have. They actually believe these things are rooted in deep philosophical truths, which brings them into conflict with progressivism. A constant mistake made by progressives is assuming that if everyone was educated, they would just naturally agree with progressivism. This is dumb, disprovable, and there are tons of intelligent dissidents who disagree with liberalism and progressivism based off of intelligent and coherent understandings of history and philosophy. Sometimes people just disagree and want the right to voice that disagreement. That being said, I think that it's actually quite possible to talk about controversial ideas from an objective lens and avoid bans or suppressions, which is a testament to the power of capital L liberalism and how entrenched it is in American culture. However, if you become too popular, promote dissident ideas as correct, or get into fights, your accounts on social media are at risk. Muslim theocrats, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, fascists, Christian nationalists, and communists can all testify to this truth. It seems like a shitload of dissidents make legally protected, nonviolent speech, but because it's hostile to progressivism and backs up an unacceptable worldview, they are suspended or banned from the platform. Now, let's admit there's a major issue with my first discussion, which is that I believe that this was because of an intentional algorithmic modification. After all, the Twitter files included phrases like do not amplify and search blacklist, meaning that non-banned accounts have been limited but not outright banned. My editor and Destiny took issue with this assessment because the purpose of the algorithm in both YouTube and Twitter is to promote virality and popularity, or in some cases, infamy. As a matter of fact, a fellow panelist brought up the fact that conservative accounts on Twitter are technically more popular than progressive accounts, so how do I explain the popularity rising above the suppression? Since that debate, someone has told me that the Twitter algorithm favors linked articles over hashtags, and as a behavioral set, conservatives tend to link supporting articles and leftists tend to use hashtags or the platform itself as where they're putting their supporting information. I, in that conversation, forwarded the debate that since progressives and liberals generally agree with each other and dominate the platform, it's likely they have less contentious engagement, whereas conservatives have both conservatives and liberals and progressives fighting in their comment section and quote tweets. I think that's still a common sense, if unprovable, theory. These two arguments aside, how are conservatives still wildly popular if they're so persecuted? It's because they're the right kind of conservative. Despite Steven Crowder and Ben Shapiro's dislike of gay people and trans folk, 95% of their content is packaged for a mainstream audience, and they're monetizable. Not just that, but they have been hemmed in by the terms of service, both in what they talk about and how they talk about it. Shapiro and Crowder have barely touched COVID vaccine efficacy and side effects, despite the fight over public response to COVID being a conservative touchstone. It's obvious they've avoided this specific topic, not out of some greater ideological aversion, but because of the repercussions to their channels and profiles if they engage with the topic. When it comes to the election, which I know is a testy subject, Shapiro only pays lip service to alleged fraud, and to my knowledge, doesn't buy into the election being changeable based off of election interference. Crowder, on the other hand, can only meme on it because of the terms of service. Now, you can say this is good. If conservatives were allowed to peddle their bullshit, then they'd convince even more millions of Americans that the vaccine is worse than COVID itself and that American democracy is now bankrupt. But is this how we should handle discourse, where bad ideas are just banned outright and a third of the country can't express their viewpoint because it's damaging or unpalatable to gatekeepers? I don't think so. And apparently, neither does Destiny, which is why he kept me very limited to defending the terms new and historic Twitter files, along with the premise that conservatives are being persecuted solely for being conservative. Perspectives that don't appear in my tweets, my content, or even in the debate itself. Now, I do understand that I brought up in the conversation a couple of points that people took issue with, but frankly, I'm fine defending them. I argued that progressive tech oligopolies have pushed the Overton window left through their suppression, which I tried to demonstrate by showing how progressive videos on controversial subjects had hundreds of thousands of views talking about issues right-wingers are passionate about, while the conservative videos themselves had 10% of the engagement. My argumentative mistake was insisting this was algorithmic instead of just content moderation through suspensions and bans. I argue that conservatives, palatable, marketable, TOS-abiding conservatives, are not on the chopping block. However, right-wingers who want to talk about COVID, the election, grooming rhetoric, Christian nationalism, race realism, fascism, are suppressed or banned. And it's not because they're not popular. That's fucking cope. The absolute cope of saying that these are niche subjects, which is a response that I received from some folks in DGG, is fucking embarrassing. They might be niche concepts, but internet e-celebrities who made Destiny look tiny a few years ago made their bread and butter off of niche, dissident, right-wing material. Whether it was Stefan Molyneux on race realism, Lauren Southern on immigration, Nick Fuentes on Christian nationalism, Red Ice TV on ethno-nationalism, The Kill Stream on trailer trash ethno-nat commentary, or Richard Spencer coalescing the alt-right, far-right pundits were dominating the algorithm until they were banned or suppressed. Considering this was major discourse leading to the adpocalypse and wall-to-wall coverage on how social media companies were radicalizing a new generation of involuntary celibate terrorists, I have to insist that people disagreeing with this point are coping fucking hard. The only conservatives left are the right kind of conservatives, people who are liberal enough or who abide by the TOS enough to maintain their channels, brands, and profiles, and half of these people have been suspended or banned as well. So pretending for a second that dissidents wouldn't be dominating algorithmically if the playing field was neutral is cope, and frankly, one of the most infuriating parts of the debate. My points were, and are, that progressives pretending the Twitter files and their surrounding implications is not a big deal is fucking cope. That progressives played semantic games about shadow bans to avoid dealing with the actual complaints about political suppression. That conservatives concerned about the opaque relationship between three-letter agencies and social media are valid and worthy addressing politically and rhetorically. That conservatives were told they were unpopular instead of being suppressed, and that's simply not true. That Elon Musk will now modify one of the world's most powerful social media platforms on the planet to serve his own fickle interests and the interests of the right wing. All of these points are reflected in my tweets and were never able to be represented in the first debate because I was assigned positions and asked to defend the perspectives that, 1, conservatives were suppressed for the simple crime of being conservative. I've never said that and would like anyone to prove the contrary. And 2, that I had to specifically find something new or historic in the Twitter files themselves, and I couldn't remark on the broader implications. Now, despite Destiny dragging me back to positions I didn't hold, autistically focusing on the word new and historic, and in general kind of being a cunt, I still respect him as an intellect and a rhetorician. Before I wrap this section up, I want to address a weird audience expectation that's logical but dumb. Destiny assigned me the job of finding new and historic issues in the Twitter files before we would discuss that subject again. Some people brought this expectation to our next conversation, but I have to point something out. Destiny is not my boss. He's not my teacher. He's not my professor, my dad, my brother, or even a close friend. He is a fun and interesting shit-talking streamer who is gracious enough to fight with smaller streamers. That day I got off work at 7 p.m. and I was on his stream at 7:05. I don't have all day to intellectually masturbate and do research. I have a wife, a kid on the way, dogs, a mortgage, hobbies, a Warhammer channel, and debate panel commitments outside of my relationship with Destiny. I didn't write down Destiny's homework assignment or even care to follow up on that part of the conversation since it was never my contention in the fucking first place. Despite the hostility, I was not particularly ass-mad over the first conversation. People forget that I'm friends with Lauren Southern and some of Destiny's closest orbiters. I know more about his personal and professional life through sheer osmosis than Destiny would care to admit. So I figured I'm not going to let a good relationship and debate partner have a rough night and let that ruin my perspective on things. Some people have been calling blue-haired Destiny Grumpstony because of him being sick and cantankerous, which I factored into my initial reaction. In the aftermath, my editor and I talked for the better part of 2 to 3 hours about the debate, writing down my actual perspectives, and you've basically just heard the arguments my editor and I had over the principles of the situation. On top of that, my editor corrected me on some details, saying that, A, YouTube has 2 principal algorithms that override everything else: the viewership algorithm and the monetization algorithm, which are, according to Google, disconnected. The reason why this is important is because popular content, however distasteful, would always do well on YouTube as long as viewership existed because of the goals of the program. Rewriting the YouTube code to factor in political affiliation and flirtations with contentious subjects would fuck up the viewership algorithm, making this not the main culprit for why conservatives wouldn't be doing well on the platform. Also, since monetization is divorced, YouTube has an incentive to demonetize creators who damage YouTube's reputation. This, in turn, disincentivizes, quote-unquote, the wrong kind of conservatives from talking about controversial content if they want to be popular and wealthy. These are perfectly fine technical points that still ignores the broader conversation. Does it matter if conservatives are being shoved out of the Overton window by an algorithm or by progressive content moderators? Does it matter that these companies have a financial interest to do so? If it's unhealthy for our society, which is leading to political polarization and schisms, it's still bad, and we should be creatively thinking about how to let people speak their minds, tackle difficult subjects, and stitch back together our social fabric. B. Twitter's Amplify program is its advertising and marketing program, and it's not known how that interacts with the popularity of tweets. So just because Twitter was limiting some creators' access to Amplify did not mean that Twitter would be able to throttle the popularity of that account. This is pretty visible with Libs of TikTok. While demonetized through the Amplify system, Libs of TikTok had special protections against banning and was only throttled after flirting with the terms of service one too many times. As a matter of fact, one of the most interesting aspects of the Twitter files was how much of Twitter moderation boiled down to manual reviews of tweets. Up until the Twitter files, a lot of people could justify their bans and suspensions as a part of a flawed algorithmic calculation. But particularly when it came to popular and controversial figures, there was often a progressive Twitter employee making an interpretive decision. Which brings us to the birthday stream. My editor stated that Supreme and Destiny were both revisiting the topic, so it might be a good time to swing by, share my developed insights, and my original positions. I began explaining my understanding of the algorithm, but Destiny and Chaeiry were so horny to jump down my throat, we never really got down that path. My mistake was uttering the phrase, could not, instead of not designed to. But at that point, the hostile tone was set, and I don't back down from a conversation just because someone is throwing their weight around. I've extended Destiny a fair amount of charity and deference in the past because of my respect for his intelligence and rhetoric. That being said, I'm not a slouch myself. I'm bilingual in French and English and did well in both public and private school in both languages. I was academically advanced my entire life and squandered my shot at an Ivy League school because I wanted to smoke pot and chase girls. I've been working since I was 17 and now have a variety of experiences in both the private and public sector, adding up to almost 20 years of professional experience. I've done business-to-business negotiations, project management, and sold people cell phones, insurance policies, and handcuffs. I've never been fired from a job, and I'm not suffering from any major mental illness or disorders that I know of, or I'm willing to admit to. So when someone treats me like an ignorant, low IQ, tinfoil hat wearing asshole, that can happen once, but if you do it again, best believe I'm going to have something to say about it. Which brings us to Hunter Biden. All right, so now I want to build out my perspective, which I was never permitted to do, from the building blocks. So indulge me for a minute. The Hunter Biden story isn't just a story of wanting to do damage to the reputation of a man running for president by posting revenge pornography of his son. Hunter Biden and his firm have been credibly accused of taking roughly $11 million from a Ukrainian gas company, several $100,000 from Chinese billionaires, and failing to report $400,000 in income from these dealings. Not only that, but communications found on the laptop in question showed that Hunter was peddling influence and may have paid kickbacks to Joe Biden himself for setting up meetings and introductions. Destiny and I have even talked about nepotism when it came to Hunter Biden and Chelsea Clinton, and the total response I got from him was, well, if it's not illegal, I don't care. Here's the problem, though. We don't know the outcomes of these investigations, which are supposedly ongoing, and they're not popular enough to maintain public attention or outcry. Not because there's no malfeasance, but because Trump and his family's nepotism and corruption dwarfs the Bidens. So this is a case where in any other year, and with any other family, this would be front page corruption story with the media hounding the Department of Justice for the outcomes. But because Trump is such a distraction, and there seems to be biblical events happening monthly, the story has been boiled down to conservatives just want to see Hunter Biden's penis laugh my fucking ass off. Just to point this out, Hunter is such a fucking degenerate, it's entirely possible that he was pretending to give introductions and influence while actually taking those proceeds and spending them on prostitutions and crack cocaine instead of passing on the profits to his dad. That being said, Hunter has been proven to be paying some of Joe Biden's bills while he was vice president and giving millions of dollars to an uncle. To pretend this isn't worthy of a serious audit and investigation is fucking absurd. The only reason why you don't see me spurging about Hunter Biden is because I know that the Trump kids are just smart enough to keep their mistresses and drug habits a relative secret. And nepotism in American politics is immoral, but not always illegal. Half the kids of politicians are burnout rejects, and the other half are political staffers, lobbyists, and lawyers. Which brings us to the suppression of the story. According to news outlets, the laptop was turned into the FBI 10 months before the October surprise, but the original shop owner made a duplicate and passed it on to the Trump campaign in August of 2020, believing the story had been buried. Now, there's things in this conversation and also in conversations since that made me consider my more conspiratorial thoughts on the matter, but I also think that there's legitimate building blocks here. Trump isn't incompetent. His litmus test for whether or not he likes you is not your competence, but whether or not you like him. He has a long list of professionals who have described him as mercurial, indecisive, and almost a toddler in his decision-making process, susceptible to flattery and manipulation. Also by 2020, Trump had proven his incompetence both in the response to COVID and his national security decisions, threatening to pull out of NATO, actually trying to just yank troops out of Afghanistan and Syria, drone striking the Iranian general, and having a handshake meet with Kim Jong-un have all been mercurial, impulsive, and potentially disastrous decisions that his cabinet and Department of Defense had to conspire in order to help him avoid blunders. I know this from two reliable sources that I don't just trust in a conversation, I trust them with my life. Both are people I've known for more than a decade, one an intelligence officer, and the other an infantry officer, both of middle rank, seasoned, and intelligent. During Trump's attempted pullout of Syria, they both admitted that in order to maintain operations on the ground, the DoD slow-rolled the withdrawal to maintain the momentum and commitments they had made to allied forces in the region. They cooked the books when it came to personnel by assigning them to temporarily assigned duty. This is a flexible designation that allowed these men to be deployed to Syria while not being counted on official troop registries. They were temporarily assigned to Iraq and to Kuwait, but had to jump bases in and out of Syria in order to keep the actual troop levels to sustain operations while not technically reporting a higher body count. Also, there's a plethora of evidence suggesting Trump's incompetence angered his closest advisors and they undermined his authority. Senator Bob Corker stated that the Trump cabinet was running an adult daycare. The allegedly corroborated White House whistleblower stated there were quote-unquote adults in the room. The public scathing statement of Secretary of Defense James Mattis, somebody who I fucking love, FBI Deputy Assistant Director of Counterintelligence Peter Strzok's statement that he wouldn't allow Trump to take office before the election in 2016, and then Trump's obstruction of the Mueller investigation. And by the way, this isn't wild conjecture. The Cato Institute openly complains exactly about what I'm talking about, and for the obvious reasons. They wish Trump was more off-leash and the deep state had interfered with him less. The pattern of Trump making impulsive decisions and high and mid-level technocrats spinning, modifying, or slowing them down is clear, visible, and public. And don't worry, we'll get into the weak-ass rebuttals I received during that debate, but for now, let's get back to the laptop and the three-letter agency's relationship with social media. If the FBI received a laptop alluding to financial corruption in the Biden family, it would be their moral responsibility to investigate that aggressively, regardless of whether or not it affected the election. Actually, opening the laptop, copying the contents, and going through it would not be the problem in either manpower or time. As a matter of fact, investigative reporter Peter Swigert of the Twitter files was able to corroborate a majority of the controversial emails with open source investigations within a day of their release. Now, maybe backlog and priority could be issues, but why would that be with a case with such serious political implications? The fact that it was even suggested in that debate that potential corruption by the Biden family could or should take an investigative backseat is fucking bananas. And it was said without a second thought, like it was obvious. Of course. Why would money getting kicked back to a presidential candidate from rival countries for clout and influence be a priority interest? And the only reason why I didn't press it is because, again, I know that the Trump family are dirtier than fucking pigs in shit. So if we know that mid-level and high-level Trump officials undermined his decisions, if we know that mid-level and high-level FBI employees had a principal beef with the president, if we know that the FBI had the alleged evidence of corruption of the Biden family 10 months in advance of the October surprise, then sure as Christ got fucking sandals would it be wild to speculate that the FBI slow-rolled the Biden investigation and spread doubt about the Hunter story, especially if it would help their preferred candidate win, especially if they could do so under the pretense of their assigned work and plausible deniability. Which gets us into the dog shit counter arguments from my opponents. Let's start with Destiny himself and why this conversation got so fucking heated. First, Destiny guffawed at the algorithmic statement, which was quickly corrected from algorithm cannot to the algorithm is not designed to. No one took issue with that amended statement except for Chaeiry, and from there we could have had a civil conversation leading to what I outlined above, but obviously nobody had the patience or charity for that conversation. Second, Destiny called me a liar. The first time legitimately took me aback, and the second time I put my foot down. I've spent the better part of 2 years on Twitch politics. I've had heated debates, calm conversations, and shit-flinging throwdown brawls that hit the radar of every major creator in the space. At no point in my Twitch or YouTube political career have I been accused of not saying what I believe or being able to back up my points. For Christ's sake, I was able to have a calm 1v1 conversation with Demon Mama and Mr. Girl. If that doesn't prove that I'm good faith and patient, I don't know what the fuck would. Which gets us into the next comment, which was so off base, I almost laughed. Get Trump's dick out of your ear. I have been anti-Trump since he made comments about John McCain's war service all the way back in 2015. Now, you can hate John McCain all the fuck you want, but Trump's comments both showed him utterly ignorant of military service and incompetent as a leader. As a matter of fact, my speculation about the Hunter Biden story is reliant on Trump being a big enough piece of shit his own administration acts against him. At most, I humored Trump as a political wrecking ball to break up the system and have described how in some cases he can be cunning and charming, but I have never defended him as a candidate or as a president. As a matter of fact, I have taken constant knives in the fucking back for not being a Trump cultist. So to be accused of being a liar by Destiny basically proved to me that he just had no idea what the fuck I was talking about or who I am. And I was just his whipping boy for all his frustrations with conservatives, which I tried to let slide. Next, if you want to disagree with my above assessment, I don't give a fuck. It's an opinion based on personal and professional experience and research. Have your own perspective, but don't treat me like an idiot for mine. Destiny asserted that I was a conspiracy theorist, and this would be one of the greatest conspiracies in American history. I don't even think it would scratch the top fucking 20. He is right, though. I do believe in plenty of conspiracies. Like the annexation of Texas was a dirty war designed to steamroll Mexico into giving up the western half of the United States. Like the U.S. government has violated endless treaties with Native Americans as long as it suits their interest. Like President Lincoln won the primary by blocking his opponent's representatives and then flooding the voting hall with his supporters. Like the USS Maine explosion likely being an accident, but it was used as a pretext for the Spanish-American War on behalf of blood-hungry capitalists wanting to take control of Cuba and the Philippines. Like the Lusitania being used as a pretext to enter World War I, but it was shipping arms along with civilians to England, making it a legitimate target, using civilians as a shield. Like the Veterans Coup, exposed by Smedley Butler, where he was approached by business owners to overthrow the government using World War I veterans. Like McCarthy lying about how deep communism ran in order to railroad leftists in the 1950s, like J. Edgar Hoover looking for blackmail against all his opponents, including Martin Luther King Jr., like John F. Kennedy greenlighting the assassination of the president of Vietnam, like Nixon covering up burglars breaking into the DNC, like Reagan selling weapons to Iran to fund narco-guerrillas fighting communists in Central and South America, like the United States selling precursors to weapons of mass destruction to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War and sharing intelligence on how to deploy them, like Donald Rumsfeld looking for a pretext to invade Iraq before 9/11, and then the Bush White House using 9/11 as leverage to launch that same war, despite it having almost no connection to the terrorist attacks, which just happened to enrich their former work associates and complete a 13-year-old vendetta. Like the Clintons using the Clinton Foundation to funnel wealth into their family by employing their daughter there, while the foundation received foreign donations as Hillary Clinton served as Secretary of State. And finally, like Trump lying in order to steal the election, and the FBI slow-rolling the Biden investigation and suppressing the Hunter Biden story because they would prefer to work with a competent Democrat over a bipolar retard. Yeah, I believe in those conspiracies that are all backed up by a good chunk of facts and some speculation. From my perspective, the rest of Destiny's contributions to that conversation were making faces, guffawing, and strawmen. So let's move on to Supreme. One of Supreme's contentions was that most public professionals are just normal guys who collect a check and go home. This was supposed to speak to an ambivalent attitude on behalf of the FBI and Department of Homeland Security agents working frequently with progressive media companies that they would just simply have no opinion on who was president. I submit to you the following. Likely fucking not. As an FBI and DHS liaison to social media, it's your job to hunt down terrorists, criminal organizations, and people trying to overthrow the government of the United States. The sitting president had proven himself incompetent and was actively talking about how if he lost, it was because the system was rigged and he should remain in office anyways. I understand that Supreme was a civilian contractor, but to assume that every civil servant, particularly civil servants sworn to the Constitution of the United States, wouldn't have some principled beef with Trump defies fucking logic. This doesn't even mention the fact that the Mueller probe, which saw Trump and the FBI publicly beef for years, and how allegiances to your institution under attack by the president, your allegiance to the republic, and your political interests could all align neatly with very little effort in your part. All perfectly excusable as investigations take time and we hear some chatter on the wire, which is hardly an endorsement of Biden or a violation of the Hatch Act. Supreme was shocked that I had never specifically heard of the Hatch Act and how it had likely governed my own affairs while I was working and how participating in political favoritism could end up with you in jail. He was so shocked, he implied that I was just ignorant of how much danger the FBI agents would be in if they performed the scheme I had proposed. There's just a few problems with this. I was never governed by the Hatch Act. As a military member, I was governed by similar rules, but not the Hatch Act itself. Also, I was enlisted, meaning I wasn't told what the statutes were that I was governed by. I was told the retard version of them. Basically, don't use your military service to make political statements on behalf of the military. That's cringe. Don't use military service to make political endorsements. That's cringe and illegal. That was the sum total of my conflict of interest briefing. Also, as a cop, I was a city police and wasn't governed by the Hatch Act, so knock that the fuck away. Also, as a law enforcement officer, I saw how investigations were prioritized for political fucking gain. If you lived in the black neighborhood and you got burglarized, tough shit. That's life. If you were one of the founders of the town and got burglarized, we posted a special duty to guard your house and conducted a months-long sting operation in order to catch the burglars, burning an insane amount of money and resources to satisfy the ego of a man with clout. To pretend that investigative priority is objective and doesn't factor into politics is either ignorant or a lie. Not only that, but I saw investigations completely disappear or be minimized to the public in order to avoid political scandal. An Orange County sheriff's deputy was operating as a mole in the department, and this was known for 2 years before they were quietly indicted and dismissed. A University of Central Florida professor was caught running a child pornography ring. The evidence was turned into the department, and he abruptly quit and left the state, and the investigation was never pursued. Slow rolling the Biden investigation would be a matter of understaffing or deprioritizing the investigation, which could never be a provable violation of the Hatch Act. Not just that, but simply telling social media companies, hey, look out, there's a lot of chatter on the wire about a big disinformation campaign coming out, wouldn't be a violation of the Hatch Act, even if you knew this would correlate with the Hunter Biden story's release. It's even remarked that the FBI was of no help during the drama because they refused to confirm any of the details of the story. You can chalk this up to bureaucratic incompetence or ongoing investigations if you want, but to guffaw at the fact that the chess pieces are on the board and the people would have the motivations to play them is disconnected from reality. Another point of contention that defies logic is the slow rolling the Biden investigation and telling social media companies that disinformation was coming out would take James Bond levels of malice and coordination. No, it wouldn't. Slow rolling the investigation would just mean understaffing it, which, considering you actually have terrorists and narco cartels to hunt down, that's perfectly justifiable. And as far as the disinformation heads up, it's just a matter of basing that off of a few schizo posts on the wire and a January hack of Burisma, and you're good to go. Pretending you need to have a 19th century fucking mustache in the coordination of the entire bureau is retarded. As a matter of fact, based on information released since this debate, it would take 3 participants, Roth, Chan, and Baker. Roth, the head of safety and trust, who appeared to be acting in good faith, Chan, an agent who worked for Peter Strzok in Russian counterintelligence, and Baker, the former general counsel of the FBI, now a Twitter executive who specifically pushed for the story to be suppressed over the objections of other Twitter employees. Also, I took a huge issue with pretending that those employed in the three-letter agencies are just average. You can say they're average for people who have a minimum of a 4-year degree, experience in a relevant field, above average physical fitness for field work, and in reference to law enforcement, the physical ability to enact violence on people, but that is not interchangeable with the average American. The average American has an associate's degree or less, doesn't have experience in a field interesting to the FBI, is 30 pounds overweight, and does not have interest or capacity for violence. For this very simple statement, I was accused of thinking everyone in intelligence in the three-letter agencies is Jason Bourne. At that point, I get that I'm being personally milked for content, but my respect for my opponents plummeted into a fucking building. There's a huge difference between a retail employee and an intel analyst, and to have that denied was patently fucking insane. Even using Supreme's own story that he went from being almost homeless to speaking Mandarin in a few years was at the very least a testament to the intelligence of people recruited for these jobs. That test might as well be in Mandarin, is a phrase to show incomprehensibility and the difficulty of the language. Mandarin is literally considered one of the most difficult languages on the fucking planet, and even then, I couldn't get a simple concession of reality. I stopped Destiny from describing every intel analyst as Jason Bourne and asked for whose benefit that statement was. When he said it was for my benefit, my respect for my opponents plummeted into a second fucking building. Jason Bourne is an intelligent, multilingual, fit, and violent action protagonist embodying all of the most extreme aspects of intelligent work. I described the flow of intel work in each responsibility so I could at least establish that I understood the flow of information and that not everybody on that chain was Jason Bourne. And I was told again by Supreme that I didn't know what I was talking about. So let's run through that real quick. There's two primary sources of information, human intelligence and signals intelligence. Human intelligence is developing relationships with flesh and blood people to develop information. Signals intelligence is catching communications via monitoring. These people don't have to be fit or violent, but they have to be relatively smart. Then, the raw data goes to a linguist for translation and an analyst who can strain out the useless information, collate and make coherent, useful data, and create actionable intelligence for a decision maker. There's all sorts of different intel operations, but if we're talking about the Department of Defense or law enforcement, the decision maker will then feed an order to a drone program or to some trigger pullers to do some dirty work. So raw data collection has to go to relatively smart multilingual people, who have to pass it on to analysts and decision makers who also have to be relatively intelligent. And if those decision makers pass on information to trigger pullers, the trigger pullers have to be relatively fit and violent. So not everyone on the chain embodies every virtue of Jason Bourne, but between a half dozen people, you get all of those virtues compiled. To which Supreme said, "Nuh-uh." And when I asked for him to say what I got wrong, he said that sometimes data collection, linguists, and analysts are all the same people, which changes almost nothing about my point and felt like a missed dumbass fucking dunk. My point was that most people in the field are above average. They're not Stephen Hawking, but they're smart. They're not the living Rosetta Stone, but they might know a few languages. They're not The Rock, but they're fit. And they're not Mongolian raiders, but they're violent. Denying this is like denying that the sky is blue. And I don't even know why you would argue these subpoints except out of a reflexive need to disagree with me. Elvis Chan, the assistant special agent in charge of the San Francisco branch, is not interchangeable with a Costco greeter. And Peter Baker, the former general counsel of the FBI, is not interchangeable with a Starbucks barista. Fucking sorry. Supreme tried to dog me by saying I was only tangentially related to the field, and as a result, I didn't know what I was talking about. But here's the problem with that. I worked for the drone program, and my best friends are trigger pullers. I have friends who worked as decision makers and analysts. I have a friend who worked human intelligence. I interviewed for human intelligence and counterintelligence myself and got to swap war stories with the boys. I have a law enforcement friend who worked open source data investigations for a regional intelligence group, which is a form of signals intelligence. Our idea of a good time is getting drunk
and talking about our exploits. So hiding behind one dogshit dunk attempt and I don't want to talk about it because of operational security doesn't fly with me when you can't bring up a strong point for how I don't know what I'm talking about. Furthermore, everything I've said is available to the public in the memoirs of warriors, politicians, and spies, some of whom I've read. Shout out to Audible for not sponsoring this video. Chaeiry and I have a limited interaction. I know her as a Destiny Orbiter with a very dry and rude tone. Sometimes the punches can be funny, but generally speaking, I haven't seen her drop into the gauntlet herself, so I don't have very many references for her debate performances and just vaguely assumed her to be a progressive based on her associations. In reference to this arc, during the first conversation, she dropped in 40 minutes into the conversation, asking why I believed conservatives were being suppressed for the simple crime of being conservative. And I explained that I had already differentiated between just being a conservative and having controversial topics you want to talk about that are prohibited by social media. And did you have a response to my clarified position? She did not, but I presumed, perhaps, based on her dry tone, that she thought I was being stupid for defending a position I didn't hold, which at that point has nothing to do with me. If I say I don't hold a position, I hold a modified position, and you attack me on the old position, that's not my inability to articulate, that's your issue with fucking listening comprehension. During the second debate, Chaeiry said that maybe since my own editor didn't agree with me, that I should go back and talk to him for a few hours before proceeding with the conversation. This was over the fact that I amended my statement for algorithms can't to algorithms are not designed to. Considering everyone else in the debate accepted the change in perspective and were ready to proceed, this felt incredibly condescending and rude. It also did not reflect the fact that my editor and I generally align on most things, respect each other, had already discussed it for hours, and I trust his expertise. This felt like a second attempted failed dunk and contributed to the hostile atmosphere. Now, this is where things get interesting. I asserted that because of my previous experience in law enforcement investigations and because of my experience in the military, I would have insights into the current affair and would like a degree of latitude with my speculations. Instead of being extended more charity, I got less, insinuating heavily that I simply had Dunning-Kruger, and because I bagged groceries at the grocery store, I knew how to run logistics supply chains. But this doesn't actually take into account my real law enforcement and military experience. I have had a lot of really interesting experiences. I've worked with some of the most interesting people on the planet. I read memoirs and histories of our world's best leaders and warriors. And so it's not merely because I did my job. It's just a building block on which to build the rest of my arguments. Instead of allowing me to build, they attacked my building block. Chaeiry began questioning my credentials and asserting that I was an investigator or had investigative skills as a mere patrolman, and Chaeiry, being the trolling bitch she is, called me a hall monitor. Now, at the time, I believed that Chaeiry had called me a hall monitor before proceeding to question my credentials, so when we landed on, I think you can concede on being an investigator, I admittedly lost my shit. My actual credentials are posted to Twitter, so feel free to review them yourself. And having someone, quote unquote, murdered in my arms was not some conscious choice to try to shock people into siding with me. It was an emotional outburst and outrage over being called a hall monitor after I've investigated homicides, domestic violence, child abuse, pedophilia, and burglaries in which I have forgotten more about law enforcement than Chaeiry learned in her criminal justice degree program. I was actually genuinely disgusted and appalled by Chaeiry and Supreme's behavior in that moment and actually think less of them, to be honest. The only person who I think a little bit more of is Chaeiry, the troll who got me to lose my shit. I don't think highly of lefties' ability to touch grass and understand the real-world implications of what they're fighting over, but it was such an artfully placed troll that I actually want to show a clip of it now. So, after racking up the high score for the amount of uses of the word cunt in a debate, the conversation further devolved into memes and nuclear warfare. To reiterate, my points were and are that progressives pretending the Twitter files and their surrounding implications is not a big deal is cope. I still believe this is absolutely true, especially with the release of the Schellenberger Twitter files that are even more damning than my previous estimations, showing conflicts of interest, incestuous relationships, information siloing, and social pressure to conform to the FBI's expectations. That progressives played semantic games about shadow banning to avoid dealing with the actual complaints about political suppression. This is just true. That conservatives' concerns about the opaque relationship between three-letter agencies and social media are valid and worthy addressing politically. The Schellenberger Twitter files revealed in particular that the primary liaison to Twitter, ASAC Elvis Chan out of San Francisco, had worked Russian counterintelligence operations under Peter Strzok and Jim Baker. Peter Strzok being the Assistant Deputy Director of Counterintelligence, stating that he would never let Trump take office, and Jim Baker being the General Counsel consulted on Russian counterintelligence operations, including those investigating Trump. Not only that, but Jim Baker, being one of 2 people at Twitter with a top secret clearance, allowed him to be the primary liaison with the FBI, going so far as to have private meetings with the FBI immediately before the Hunter Biden story drop with no other Twitter employees present. The incestuous relationship, the meetings with no one else present, the pushing to suppress legally protected speech, it's all right there for anyone willing to consider it for more than a second. That conservatives were told they were unpopular instead of being suppressed, and that is simply not true. If you want to fall back on terms of service, I submit to you the following Twilight Zone episode. A world in which Twitter was conservative, you were allowed to talk about everything on Twitter except for immigration and abortion. If you talked about those, you were moderated aggressively, throttled, or banned. Would you truly fight that in such a world, it's not a bias or a slant against progressives, it's just merely a terms of service violation? I don't think any honest person would. Now, Elon Musk will modify one of the world's most powerful social media platforms to serve his own fickle interests and the interests of the right wing. This is undeniably true, and it's already fucking happening. Now, I was told by my opponents that I asserted conservatives were suppressed for the simple crime of being conservative. I haven't. This is either ignorance or a lie. I was told that I had to specifically find something new or historic in the Twitter files themselves, and I couldn't remark on the broader implications. I reject this framing. I'm a free person in a free country. I can talk about whatever the fuck I want to when I want to talk about it. And on top of that, since our conversation, the Twitter file drops I would contend are both new and historic. I was called a liar. I'm not. I was told to take Trump's dick out of my ear. I never had it in there, and half of my reasoning is reliant on Trump being a massive dumpster fire of a person. I was told that my professional credentials and reasoning skills weren't relevant. They are. I was called a hall monitor. I proudly served as a school resource officer and think it's one of the best jobs on the planet. I was told I shouldn't claim being an investigator. I have receipts for the investigations I conducted that resulted in really terrible people going to jail and prison. I was told that I thought every intelligence employee was Jason Bourne. I didn't. And I don't. I was told I don't know what I'm talking about. Not only do I, but the criticism of my ignorance was shallow, uncharitable, and fucking stupid. I'm not pretending for a moment that I argued well or didn't get upset, but I also contend that everyone in that conversation was being a rude, uncharitable cunt, and in a few days, I think our relationships have changed. So, where does this leave me with the other participants? When it comes to Straighter Aid, we talked on Chud Logic's review of the debate, and she admitted she was trolling and being a dick behind the scenes for the lulz. Considering it was so perfectly targeted and executed, and considering the results, I have to concede the comedic talent. When it comes to Chaeiry, I will not accept that condescendingly shooing people away from a conversation, questioning their professional experience, and then trying to dunk on a triggered reaction in a dog pile was done in good faith, and she was just asking questions. She's reached out to talk about it. Maybe we'll clear the air. When it comes to Supreme, not only did he nitpick the fuck out of my perspectives, he participated in the dog pile, threw a kick in when I was clearly angry, and seemed to be painfully obtuse towards the end of the conversation. I think a dumb person would think that Supreme was dumb, so he was either emotionally triggered himself to not see what I was saying, or he just felt like I was being such a dick, I deserved the dog pile. Either way, I'm not going to be expecting charity from him in the future. Furthermore, in Chud's Discord, he stated that even if I was vindicated, he still wouldn't change his mind because my reasoning was faulty. The reasoning everyone was dogpiling me over, the reasoning I got maybe 10% of my arguments out before being interrupted, the reasoning they discounted at every turn? Sure, okay, fucking buddy. When it comes to Destiny, I'm on high alert. I don't think I did anything to warrant my treatment in either conversation, and I'm actually a little disappointed because I thought we had more rapport than we do, and particularly in the first conversation, there were a half dozen opportunities to stop and just ask me what I thought instead of projecting his framing onto me. When I engage with his content going forward, 1, I'm going to be looking for those kinds of things. 2, I'm going to try not to get trapped in the same snares. And then 3, if he repeats those behaviors, I'm going to call them out as they occur. Particularly considering the recent Twitter files, I'm wondering if he's sitting as comfortably right now and if he'll just ignore this and the new Twitter files that bring up almost all of my points. People on Twitter seem to just shove their heads in the sand deeper and deeper, so I'm not really hopeful for any kind of concession. Which brings us to the end. For now. If you like this video, like, share, and subscribe. Leave comments below, join the Discord and Patreon, and I'll catch you in the next one.